In this video, we're going to create a corner bridle joint that's going to join the legs of our stool to the cross-halving joint that we formed in the last video. Once again, we're going to be using nothing but simple hand tools, no machine tools. So, without further ado, let's get to it. We're going to start by having a look at our cross-halving that we assembled last time out, deciding upon which way up this is going to go. In my case, I wish to hide this knot underneath the actual seat itself that's going to go on top, so we will treat this as our bottom face, and this is where we're going to start. First thing I'll need to do before I do so though, is take these two parts apart so I can get better access. So starting on the underside, we are going to have to mark 40mm back from the edge of our chosen part, as this is the width of the leg that we are going to have to accommodate in this bridle joint. Once we've marked that out, we can take our tri-square, making sure it's flat up against the edge of the wood, score this across, and this is going to mark the bottom side of our joint. We are actually going to work in a slight angle to our legs here, so we're also going to mark 4mm further along, and we're going to carry this up onto the upper side of our work. So this line here, we're going to take this up the way, carrying it over the sides, like so. As you can see, I'm referencing off the same plane, so I don't end up with two crooked sides. And this line here is where we're going to have the top of our joint. Okay. By having the top offset from the bottom, we're going to work in an angle that's going to splay our legs out just a little bit so that we can stack everything on top of itself. We can do the same thing with each one of our legs here. Decide upon which face you want facing in and out. Take our inner face, in my case I'm going to hide this knot, and we'll measure 40mm in. 44 as well, just to match the angle. Tri-square across. Move to my second mark. Carry this up to the top face. And across the top to finish our marking out with the tri-square and pencil. So now it's time to start marking out the width of either side of our bridle joint and the gap in between. Now 40 doesn't really divide into 3 all that well, so what we're going to do is we're just going to round it to the nearest millimeters. So if we measure 13mm in from either side, we should have a 14mm gap left in the middle. Set up your marking gauge to 13mm. Score from your mark on the bottom along the top, and along the back side there. Same goes for the other side. I'm going to score along here. I'm going to score along here. And along the back, like so. Now, if you're struggling to see these marks, you can take your pencil. Because there's a little groove there now, it should be easy enough just to run your pencil along there, and they will keep you right. Like so. Now to repeat the same thing on our leg. So now it's time to start actually cutting these joints. Now, in our case, we are going to take the middle section out of our top parts, our cross-halving parts, and we're going to take the sides out on our legs. So we're going to have to offset our cut to the inside of these lines here, as this is the part we need to remove, and we don't want it being any wider than we need it to be. Using your thumb as a bit of a stop, you can set up your saw so that you're sawing down the wastewood side of the line. Having your wood set up at an angle like this allows you to see both the top end and the side, so you're able to run your saw down the side along the line and along the end, and then match the two up at 45 degrees to get yourself a nice clean cut. So now that I've got my lines established, I can start to bring my saw back to 45 degrees, run along either one of these lines, and I will follow these lines exactly. When that one's cut, switch the wood around, and we cut down the other side. Again, starting at an angle so as we can follow the pencil line, keeping things nice and straight. And then start to bring it back on our angle so it matches with the grooves that we made with our previous cuts. Last of all, straighten your wood up in your vise and simply cut down following the guides that we made with our previous cuts. Switch over and let's do the other side. So now that we've cut either side of our joint, we need to remove this centre piece of wood. Easiest way to do this is with a coping saw by taking it to the bottom of one of your cuts, turning a corner and chopping it off at the bottom, and then using a chisel to tidy things up afterwards. You can do the entire thing with a chisel, but it will take some time. So when you come to cut the bottom of this joint, bear in mind that the joint is higher on one side than it is on the other, and you will have to cut at a little bit of an angle. Pay close attention to both sides of the joint as you're cutting this bottom piece out. Start just a little bit from the bottom of the joint, turn your saw, check on the far side, well above the line, so that's fine. We're going to aim for this bottom corner. Quick double check, still above the line. Double check, perfect. And there's the majority of the wood gone in one shot. We can now switch our coping saw around and cut directly across the bottom of the joint just to square things off a bit. Yeah, and keep an eye on the far side. And that's the majority of our joint now cut. All we need to do is take a chisel through the middle here just to tidy out any scrap wood that's still there, or take it down the line if we're a little bit above the line still. So, taking our chisel, we can simply run this across the bottom of our joint by hand, simply tidying up any sort of excess wood that's here. Be careful not to go all the way through the joint, as you run the risk of splitting the wood on the far side. So just work from your line, from your mark that you made, into the centre of the joint, just to make sure there's a nice back surface there at the correct angle for our legs. That's nicely on our mark on this side. We'll switch around. I'm actually going to get my mallet to do this section. So whenever I'm using a mallet, I tip the chisel up the other way around, as this allows the chisel to rise up out of the wood rather than dig down into it. That's as far as I want to go with that. We're going to go in by hand and just make sure there's no rough bits sticking up, and that's nice and smooth. But make sure not to go all the way through, like we said earlier. We'll come back the other way just to double check it. That should be us all done. You can look directly through the joint to see whether or not it's entirely flat the whole way through. This one looks pretty good. If you're in doubt, you can also set this up with a steel rule. If the steel rule rocks back and forward, you've got a bit of a high spot in the middle. Mine is sitting pretty steady there, so that tells me that if there is a high spot, it's on either end of the joint, which is absolutely fine, as that's where we want the joint to make sure it's closed. Now, either side of this joint might be a little bit on the thick side just now, but I'm going to leave them that way, as I'd like to cut the other side of our joint, see how well it fits, and then adjust accordingly so we get a nice tight fit that's going to not fall apart. Now, the good news is that cutting the leg side of our bridle joint is far easier, as we're removing the outside two faces here, so we can gain access to this with a saw from either side. However, the first step is still the same. We are still going to cut down these lines here at a diagonal in our bench vise. This time, instead of offsetting to the inside of the line, we're going to offset to the outside of the line. So this ends up slightly thicker than what we've marked out. As I said previously, we can adjust that later with a chisel if it turns out to be a little bit on the wide side. Again, take our thumb, use this as a starting point. Cut a guide down either side of the wood. Make sure that you're following the line. So that is offset to the outside. And once we have our guide cuts in place, we can just continue on at 45 degrees until we hit the corners. Switch it around. Again, we're going to follow the line down on this side. Start to work our way back along the angle. And now that we have guides on all three sides of our bit of wood, we can straighten things up in our vise and cut directly down. Make sure to stop at your lines on both sides. So I'm done here. I need to come down a bit further on this side. That should be that. Same thing goes for the other side of the line. Continue down the backside, following the line as closely as we can. And when that's nice and straight, guide's finished. I'm going to turn this around so that I can see my short side. I guess get a kit. Cut directly down. Make sure you check both sides as you're cutting. That's me pretty much down to the line on one side, and we're not far off on the other as well. So just tip the saw forward a little bit to get a little bit more angle on that. And that looks like we're done. Now, when it comes to cutting the side of our joint, what we're going to do is we're going to take the lines that we marked out earlier on and join these up to give us our angle. Starting from the bottom there, going to the top line, we have a little bit of an angle on there. Do the same one this way around. So in this case, we're starting on our top line. We're going to go, and this is the part that we want to take off. So we're going to construct a fence using a scrap piece of wood, place that upon our work, take a clamp, and clamp this in place where we want the cut to happen. We want to be able to just see our pencil line and no more. Get it into position, tighten it up, give it a little wiggle while it's a bit on the loose side, making sure that's exactly where we want it to be, and then lock that off so as it's not going to move when we start cutting. Taking our tenon saw, place this up against our fence, and simply cut down to our next cut. Simple as that. Repeat the process on the other side. So as before, we want to be able to see the pencil line that's there, but no more. Yeah, I'm using my hand here just to make sure it's up against my fence and I'm not cutting it in at an angle. But once we've started a groove, we can take that away and just cut freely. A little bit further on the back side. And there we go. And that is the majority of the work done. So at this point, we're going to want to check the fit of our joint. In my case, things are a little bit too wide in the middle, so we're not going to go together quite yet. But it's easy enough for us to take a chisel and shave a little bit of wood off at either side here. We could do it on the inside faces here, but as they are obstructed, it's a little bit harder to see what you're doing. So best to start here before we start taking anything out of this. We still have our pencil marks here as a reference point, so we should know when we've gone too far based on them. Now we're only looking to take a small amount of wood off of either side of this part so as it fits into our groove. We can use a chisel as I showed you in the previous video when making our cross-halving joint, but a safer way to do this in this case is to use this thing here. It's called a granny's tooth. It's not essential. Like I said, you can use a chisel as we did last time out, but this will allow you to set a specific height from the edge of our wood to the part of wood that we are cutting. And we can do that from either side to make sure that this stays dead center. So we want to set this up so it's barely taking any wood off, and that's pretty much where we're at just now. Okay, I'm just kind of scratching the top. I'm very much anchoring this hand to the wood because I don't want this slipping down as we're doing this. So that's a good starting point from this side here. I'm not going to go all the way through. I don't want to split the back edge of the wood here. So we can turn things around. Just double check from the other side as well. And the good news is that this is very level. This is what this has proven to me so far, is that the cuts we made were in fact very straight relative to this edge here. We'll flip the wood over and we'll double check the other side to see if there's any discrepancy in width. So this side's not quite making contact. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch to the other side, take a little bit more off first, and then come back to see. So when we go to take a little bit more off, we don't want to take a huge amount. So we're going to loosen off this bolt at the back, turn this a half turn, tighten that back up, and that should just be a tiny little bit more that we're taking off. Same as last time, we're going to work in from this side. Hopefully you can see that starting to take a little bit more wood now. Again, to avoid splitting the wood, I'm not going to go all the way through. I'm going to come back the other direction. Let's tidy up that little corner in there. So we're now level on this side, a little bit deeper than we were before. not taking this all the way. I'm just working to the edge, and I'll work back, as I want to avoid splitting the wood. That's me fairly happy with that side there. So we'll switch over and we'll see if we need to take anything off the other side. That's only just starting to make contact with the wood there. So we'll just make sure that this side is nice and level. Which it does seem to be at the moment. Switch over to the other side. Definitely had more to take on the other side. I'll just make sure that's leveled off. And we'll go double check our fit. So after a little bit of tidying up with our granny's tooth, that is our bridle joint now slotting together nicely with little in the way of gaps on either side. You will notice that there are a few bits of wood protruding on either side of the joint. We're going to take these off with a plane once we have this glued up, but we're not going to glue this joint up at this moment in time. We're going to make sure that all of our parts are ready to go before we glue things up. One last important point we want to make before we finish up on this joint is to number your joints. So this is joint 1, joint 1. Okay, so I can't get things confused when I go to glue things up. Now to simply repeat the process another 4 times for each one of the legs. In the next video, we will turn our attention to making the seat that will go on top of our stool.